And good evening to all, and thank you for the invitation. Right, so I will give a general picture of the present state of what has been called in 2011 the Arab Spring, and now people are looking for terms.
Can you speak up a bit further back here?
Yep, okay. So I'll give a general introductory picture of the ongoing events, but putting them in this short-term or middle-term historical perspective. After which Samah will be focusing on the present situation in Sudan, and so we hope like this to give you enough information about what's going on, in the hope also that there should be some more active solidarity with what's happening today in the region, and especially in Sudan, where the situation has become very tough in recent weeks, as you know. So solidarity is definitely needed. I'll get back to that, and we can say that until now we haven't seen anything looking like what would be needed and what should be expected from the anti-imperialist, or whatever one wants to call it, left in this country. Especially with the peculiarities that we will describe of what is going on in Sudan. But first, just a reminder of the changes of mood when it comes to this part of the world that is the Middle East and North Africa, as it is usually called. I mean, we remember in 2011 that there was a lot of euphoria at the moment, at the time of what was called the Arab Spring, and this euphoria was based on expectation of a relatively smooth and rapid change, which would be essentially a democratization of these countries. That's how what was going on was interpreted by the mass media, by the dominant perspective, by the mainstream understanding, the global mainstream understanding of what was going on, which was also in large part actually wishful thinking. This so-called Arab Spring came as a surprise to many, in the sense that they had absorbed the Orientalist, that is the kind of stereotyping views of the region as being steeped in its own Islamic Arab culture, whatever it is, and therefore enjoying despotism as part of its culture. And suddenly, people had to realize that in that part of the world, like everywhere else, people are longing for democracy and social justice, to take the term generally used. And there were some, kind of blatant statements of this surprise and the discovery that, after all, the peoples of this region are like us, in this very Western-centered Orientalist perspective. But then, 2 years later, the region was in the midst of a full relapse or full counter-revolutionary backlash, with the most tragic part being the civil war in Syria. That was followed, where the regime went on the offensive, on a large-scale offensive with Iran's support, in the year 2013, and that was followed soon after by the coup in Egypt, reinstating the authoritarian regime, but in a version that is quite worse than what existed before, so that people are actually now almost missing Hosni Mubarak and his time. And then we had the generation of the conditions in Libya, in Yemen, where the situations evolved into civil war. So all that led to a massive comeback of the Orientalist trope and the kind of comments about, well, we told you, these people are not prepared culturally for democracy or whatever it is, and that's what you get when you try to destabilize authoritarian governments. And the expectation was similarly that with this backlash, that was the end of it. The Arab Spring had ended, and we had entered into some kind of Arab winter, and that was it. That was a short parenthesis, historical parenthesis, and limited to that. And there you see again, starting from Sudan last December, followed by Algeria last February, we see two new upsurges, which are very much comparable to the most important upsurges in 2011, to the uprisings that we had in 6 Arab countries. Just for a reminder, it was started in Tunisia, spread to Egypt, then to Libya and Yemen and Syria and Bahrain. So we had 6 major uprisings, with all the region being shaken by very powerful social movements and social turmoil. And now we see again, after that relapse and this counter-revolutionary period that the region have been into since 2013 until last year, we see now a new upsurge in 2 countries, which is very much comparable in scale to the uprisings, the major uprisings of 2011. And in this, we can see confirmation of the one brand of analysis that was saying in 2011 that what was occurring was not going to be just a spring. That means, a brief and smooth transition, but that was actually only the beginning of a long-term revolutionary process that would carry on and unfold over many, many years, and actually many decades, one could say, given the complexity of what is at stake in the region. And that analysis, 2011, was based on exploring the real roots of this explosion that were not just Facebook or whatever, as you could believe from the dominant interpretation, just a kind of cultural shock or just the democratic aspiration which had been fostered by an opening to international or global culture through the new media, ways of communication. But it was much deeper than that. It was the outcome of a deeply rooted social economic crisis. This whole part of the world has been in a stage of economic astheny, lethargy, over several decades, with very low rates of growth, especially when compared to the demographic growth of the region. And one most striking and central result of that was the fact that the region held for many, many years, and still holds, and even more so, the world record when it comes to unemployment, and especially youth unemployment, the highest rates of youth unemployment in the world as in the region. And from that perspective, when you understand this in this way, and you understand that this is a deep structural crisis of a whole system that is not only a matter of political regime, but a matter of social, economic, and political system, then you understand that that's not going to be changed in weeks or months or even a few years. It's a process that will take a long time unfolding, and that will be very hard, very difficult, given the very repressive character and despotic character of the states in the region, and that you will have, like in every long-term revolutionary process, phases of upsurge and phases of backlash, revolution, counter-revolution, restoration, all this cycle, which is well known in the history of any long-term revolutionary process, like the English one, the French one, the Chinese one, or whatever. This kind of sequence is what we will see in the region, what we could foresee since 2011 very clearly, and all the more in that we are speaking of a region that is, the comparison here would not be the English Revolution or the French Revolution, but the whole European transformation, or at least Western Europe, to take a more homogeneous part of the world. So from that perspective, what was to be expected was that you could have successive phases, politically speaking, but socially, with the explosion of 2011, with the lid being removed from this boiling situation there, this social turmoil would not stop. And that's exactly what happened. That's what the media don't pay much attention to. They pay much more attention, as we know, to any group of crazy cutters of heads or whatever it is, than to big social movements. But you had big social movements throughout these years in most countries of the region, in Morocco, in Tunisia itself, which is presented as the success story because of the democratic gains of the Arab Spring, but Tunisia is far from having solved those structural problems that I mentioned, and it has seen quite a number of social, local, or even national upsurges since then. In Sudan has been through several upsurges also, one in 2013, one in 2011, and so there were a number of events before the present major uprising, that's how we should call it, in Jordan, in Iraq. So, I mean, many countries of the region have seen this continuous social turmoil, and if it didn't happen in Egypt recently, that's because of the very harsh repression that took place in that country in 2013, and the very despotic character of the Sisi regime, and political problems, which we could get back later on, connected to the lack of alternatives and the disappointment of the mass movement, with an experience over 3 years leading to a return of the old regime in a worse version. And speaking of Egypt, the Egyptian experience, which for obvious reasons, given the centrality of Egypt as the largest population of all Arab-speaking countries, and even a country that is very central, even geographically speaking, the attention given to Egypt is naturally higher than that to any other country. So this model of Egypt is very much known by the populations of the region, and we can see how much this affects what's going on now in Sudan and Algeria. That is because, and especially for these two countries, Egypt is very much, let's say, an experience from which they can draw major lessons. And that's because one thing that is common to the three countries, Sudan, Algeria, and Egypt, is that among all Arab-speaking countries, these three countries are those where the armed forces are the center of gravity of political power. So they are in some way military dictatorships, even if they can be a liberal military dictatorship as the one you had in Algeria, or a semi-liberal one that like the one we had in Egypt under Mubarak, or a fully despotic one like in Sudan. But what they have in common, that basically they are military dictatorship. That is, the army is the real center of power, and it's the army that makes kings, that is presidents, that makes presidents in that country, in those countries. That's a difference with several other countries of the region, like the monarchies and the monarchy-like republics of Syria or Libya under Gaddafi, where you have ruling families completely controlling the state and owning the state and turning the armed forces or the elite bodies of these armed forces into their private militias, their private guards. That's not the case in the three countries that we mentioned because of that. That it's more a rule by the army as an institution. It is at the center of political power. And there you can see how similar the scenario is. In 2011, when you had this big uprising, after weeks of protests, big, massive protest, the military came to the conclusion that the president had become a hot potato, and they got rid of the president. That's what you can have in such regimes, which you wouldn't have in Syria, for instance, or in any of the monarchies, because you have Praetorian guards, and therefore, in order to topple the ruling family, you have to break the state. You have to clash with the whole, the core of the state, and that will be very brutal. What we had in Egypt was the army removing the president in order to preserve the regime. So the regime hasn't changed, but there you could get rid of the tip of the iceberg while preserving the iceberg, which you cannot do in the other situations that I mentioned, okay? Where they are stuck, you can't separate the tip and from the mass from the body, main body of the state. So that's what we had, and indeed we had a repetition of that in Sudan. In Algeria first, the army pushed Bouteflika, the president, away, and the same in Sudan, even more like Egypt, the military council removed Omar al-Bashir, the president. But revolutionary processes in history are also learning processes, and you have a learning curve of the mass movement, and people assimilate the lessons. And here, although we're not, not speak of the same country, but because everybody knows what happened in Egypt, you have this sharp awareness of this. And therefore, one key result of this is that we haven't seen in the two countries the kind of illusions that we have seen in Egypt about the army. On two occasions, 2011, 2013, the vast majority of the mass movement in Egypt believed in the, in some progressive role of the army, that the army will fulfill the aspirations of the mass movement. And then they were very bitterly disillusioned. Now, this lesson has been very well understood, and that's why we can see very clearly that in both countries, in Algeria and Sudan, the mass movement did not fall in that trap at all, and demands that the army relinquish power and that you have a civilian democratic government. That's a very, very clear and central demand of the movement in the two countries. And here, speaking of learning process and all that, we come, and that will be the final point I will discuss, to the issue of the leadership. Because one very crucial factor in the fate of the 2011 Arab Spring was the issue of leadership. It's not new to anybody here, I'm sure, in that room, that leadership issues are absolutely crucial in revolutionary politics. And the fact is that you had this massive uprising that you had in 2011, the beginning of this long-term revolutionary process, happened at a time when you had practically no leaderships in the region that were able to embody or represent the aspirations of the movement and be strong and powerful enough and well organized enough to lead the movement into the fulfillment of the popular aspirations. The closest we have been to such a situation is Tunisia, because of the existence, and that was actually, if you are looking for a reason why it started in Tunisia, that's it. That's the reason. It's the only country in the region where you had an autonomous, powerful workers' movement. Autonomous, at least at the grassroots level, rank and file, intermediary level. That was a genuine labor movement, and which had been on previous occasions, clashed with the government, and which were absolutely instrumental in transforming what started as a regional protest into a national uprising, and that managed to transform the political institutions, at least in the sense of democratizing them in Tunisia. So aside from that, there were no leaderships that were up to the level of what was required. And even in Tunisia, the labor movement did not play a role beyond ensuring the democratic transition. That's why, actually, again, here, that's why Tunisia is a success story. It's not because this country has such a marvelous culture or whatever that kind of explanation. It's because of the labor movement, and that's one thing that you won't find in political science, the very obvious connection between democracy and the labor movement and the workers' movement, the existence of a free, union, real labor union freedoms. So what we have here in the two countries are quite different cases. In Algeria, we are in a situation that is rather similar to those of 2011, in the sense that there is no recognized leadership of the movement. It's more like actually from that angle like what we had in Syria at the beginning, except that in Syria it was even better organized in the form of what was called the local coordination councils. Even that is not there in Algeria. It's a very, people spoke a lot of leaderless about 2011, which was not accurate, but if anything is leaderless, the closest to that would be what's happening in Algeria. This is despite attempts by some to create some kind of representation, but that's nothing that is recognized by the whole popular movement. And therefore, we are stuck in this situation, and the army has the initiative. We have a movement demanding civilian democratic government, but not able to translate that into concrete demands in the face of an army that is ruling down the country very openly, and which is looking forward to organizing some kind of transition that would remain very much within the parameters of the regime, that is new elections and things of the kind, and then proclaim that it's the end of it. Well, in Sudan we have something very different, and Samah will be discussing the country, but I must say in comparative terms it's the most advanced case of leadership that we have seen in any of the uprisings up until now in the region since 2011. This is the most advanced one because you have a recognized leadership and a progressive recognized leadership of the mass movement, which is the Forces for the Declaration of Freedom and Change, which the initiative for which was by one of the key organizers of all that in Sudan, which is the Sudanese Professional Association, as it's called, which was created by underground 3 years ago by doctors and journalists and lawyers who organized underground in order to carry on the fight against the Bashir regime. And then we had more recently the formation of this around a declaration, a joint declaration, where you have this professional association that now got much larger than it was at the beginning, with a lot of other professional or labor groups joining. We have political parties and a rather wide spectrum of political forces, from the Communist Party to liberal Muslim party like the Ummah Party, and armed struggle movements of like Darfur, of some of the ethnic wars that were going on in Sudan, or the South Sudan Liberation Army, the north part of it, and feminist movements. That's even more of a peculiarity of, or a point in showing the advancement of what's going on in Sudan compared to what we had elsewhere. And so that's, there we can see there is a leadership. This leadership has a very clear program about the transition and all that. They've designed a quite detailed blueprint for the transition. And they didn't fall also in the trap of asking or accepting elections to be organized at short notice, because they know that that would benefit to the powers that be, and that have all the means and all that. So that's why they ask for a relatively long transitional period of 4 years. Now they accepted 3 years before the organization of elections. And during which there will be institutions created by the mass movement, by its leadership, and that's what they got into negotiation with the army. As you know, now I leave it to Samah to speak of the ongoing situation, but since the 3rd of June, you have had a brutal crackdown faced by a general strike. I won't get into a more detailed discussion of that. We'll have the opportunity to all of us discuss this again. But just to say very briefly two things. What will be decisive is the ability in Sudan, as in Algeria, but that's essentially in Sudan where the prospects are, the alternative is clear. The decisive issue will be the impact of the mass movement on the armed forces. That is, whether the military command feels that they can carry on suppressing by stages, gradually, this mass movement without a rebellion in the ranks of the armed forces. And that's something that the leadership understood quite well, because many of their statements were appealing to the soldiers and the lower ranking officers and all that of the armed forces. So that will be crucial. And also what I started with, the solidarity issue. It's really, really very important, because you have an international reactionary support, especially by the Saudi Kingdom and United Arab Emirates and Egypt, and which are the best friends of Donald Trump, the three countries, and of London, also of the government of this country. They are very much involved in supporting the military. Well, European governments, Britain included, have taken, well, at least on the face of it, they paid at least lip service to democracy and all that by demanding that those responsible for the repression be judged, and an international inquiry and things like that. But really, the movement in Sudan would need much stronger support by the workers' movement, by the progressive movement, by the democratic movement, the feminist movement, the anti-racist movement, in order to exert pressure on the governments for the benefit of the Sudanese popular leadership.
Thank you.
Thank you.